It's my honor now to introduce to you Enrico Moretti, the professor of economics at the University of California at Berkeley. He holds the Michael Peavy and Donald Weil Career Development Chair in Labor Economics. He's the Director of Infrastructure and Urbanization Program at the International Growth Center, London School of Economics. And he counsels for the World Bank and the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. He has been featured in New York Times and Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and his book, The New Geography of Jobs, was defined by Forbes as the best economic book of the year. We invited Dr. Moretti to come speak to us so we could understand the geography of jobs, which in fact is the title of his book. So please help me give a San Francisco welcome to Dr. Enrico Moretti.
Thank you. Good morning. Nope. Okay, over the past 12 months, the San Francisco labor market has been one of the most dynamic in the nation. We added almost 20,000 new jobs. Payroll is up by 4%, so a very strong performance. San Francisco is not the only city doing well at the moment. If you look at wages and jobs, there's a number of other large metro areas that have been performing particularly well. Obviously San Jose, Seattle on the West Coast, Austin and Raleigh in the South, Boston and Washington, D.C. on the East Coast stand out. In my book, I call this city and other like that America's brain hubs because of their industry mix and their skill mix. There are three features of their economy that stand out. First of all, these cities had, although a painful recession, less of a painful recession than the rest of the country. Second, the recovery is faster in these cities than in the rest of the country. And third, and most importantly, the brain hubs have been growing consistently for the past 3 decades. So their prosperity is not just a short-run cyclical phenomenon tied to the current ups and downs of the recession, but it's a long-run secular trend that puts them among the most successful labor market in the nation. Now, what they have in common are two things. One is that they have a very large fraction of workers in the labor force that has a college degree or a master's degree. And two is that they have a very large fraction of their employers in the innovation sector broadly defined. And these are the two key predictors of economic success of a city today, human capital and innovation. It didn't used to be this way. If you look at the first 3 decades after World War II, what you see is that cities that are doing particularly well are cities where there's a lot of physical capital and a lot of infrastructure. Places like Detroit or Flint had some of the most successful labor market and some of the best paid workers in the nation because labor there had access to the best machine and the most developed infrastructure, physical infrastructure there. Today, it's not physical capital that matters, it's human capital that matters. And the US has vast differences in the level of human capital across its cities. This shows you the share of workers with a college degree in the labor force, which is one key indicator of human capital. And it shows you that human capital varies enormously across US cities, with some location having a lot of human capital, and other location having almost no human capital. Not surprisingly, the cities that are very dark in this map are also the cities that are increasingly responsible for a larger and larger share of US GDP. This map shows you economic output per square kilometer, which is a good measure of labor productivity. And what's striking about this picture is that you see a handful of big peaks on the East Coast, where New York and Boston and DCs are, in the middle, where Chicago is, with some shrinking little peaks where the former Rust Belt cities were, And then on the West Coast, where LA, San Francisco, and Seattle are. But they're surrounded by an ocean of very, very little economic activity. Another way of putting this is that if we were to drop 70% of the land mass from the US GDP wouldn't change all that much. The key point here is that the cities with the big peaks are also the cities that have the dark areas in the previous map. So these are the cities where workers are highly educated. Not only that, but these are also the cities where there is most investment in innovation. One way to measure innovation is patents per worker. You can measure innovation using R&D investment or other indices. They all give the same picture. Again, it's an ocean of pretty much nothing with a few key locations that are responsible for creating most of the US innovation. So the picture that emerged is that a handful of brain hubs with a very highly skilled labor force, highly productive labor, and high wages that are accounting for a larger and larger fraction of US GDP. Now, to give you a sense of how different labor markets are in the US, I ranked all the US cities based on the share of college graduates in the labor force. And these are some of the cities that appear in the top 10 group. I dropped college towns like Ann Arbor because they're not all that interesting for my purposes now. So in the top group, you see a place like DC, where 49% of workers have a college degree or more. Boston, 47%. San Francisco, 47%. You have Raleigh, Seattle, and Austin. Okay? Obviously, these are all very important innovation centers. Wages here are high, both for college graduates, but also for high school graduates. So they're high not just at the top, but also for the middle class, those workers who don't have a master's degree or a college degree. Now let me show you the cities at the bottom of this ranking. So cities that have very low degree, a very low penetration of college graduates. These are literally the four cities at the bottom of the list. Merced and Visalia stand out. They're like 300 miles from here. They're a driving distance from here. But it's almost as if they were from a different universe. Only 11% of workers in those two cities have a college degree or more. Now, let me just put this difference in perspective. Compare Visalia or Merced with San Francisco. We're talking about more than 4 to 1 difference in the penetration of college graduates in the labor force. This is an enormous difference. This is much larger than the difference that we see between the US as a whole and poor developing countries like Peru or Bolivia. So it's almost as if in this country we have advanced, sophisticated post-industrial economies with very highly skilled labor force and a highly innovative labor force, and then we have developing country economies with almost no human capital, virtually no innovation, only traditional occupation, and extremely low salaries. If you compare the salaries between this group and the previous groups, one thing stands out. A high school graduate here makes much more than a college graduate in this group. Of course, the cost of living is different. But it must mean that the productivity of workers here, their innovation, the amount of innovation that they produce is much higher than the productivity and the innovation that workers in this group. Otherwise, employers wouldn't be here. That's the flip side of this chart. Employers are here, and they keep being here to an increasing degree because these workers, it is true they're expensive, but they're also much more productive, and they're much more innovative. So there's nothing really new about the fact that there are poor cities and rich cities in a country. There's always been that. But what's new today is the degree of these differences and the fact that these differences keep growing. Here, I show you one of the many indicators that I could use to track the growth, the faster growth that the brain hubs have experienced over the past 30 years relative to the rest of the nation. Okay, this is the earnings of college graduates. Cities that already had high earnings and high penetration of college graduates have experienced a much faster growth in earnings than cities that started off with lower level of earnings and less college graduates. Another way of saying it is that we live in an economy where the winners are getting stronger over time. And the losers are getting weaker, at least in relative terms, over time. You see the same divergence, whether you use other indicators, whether it's indicators of human capital, whether it's in health indicators. We're seeing a growing divergence in health indicators, with places like here improving their health, average health levels, for example, longevity, much faster than the rest of the country. Family stability, crime, political participation, political attitudes. We're diverging as a country, and the brain hubs are taking off on a much faster rate. Now, the key question that I want to address is, what does this all mean for the average worker? Because it's clear that not all of us can work for Google or Apple or a biotech startup. And in fact, if you look at the data, the vast majority of workers, even in a place like Silicon Valley and even in a city like San Francisco, are not working in high tech. In fact, if you look at labor force data, what you're going to see is that only a minority of workers work in high tech, less than 20% in San Francisco. 65% of the workers in our area work in the local service sector. What's the local service sector? Well, it's a sector that produces a service or a good that is both produced locally and sold locally. And it includes a vast variety of occupations. If you're a waiter, you're part of the service sector. If you're a taxi driver, you're part of the service sector. If you're a carpenter, you're part of the local service sector because your service is locally sold. But it also includes professional jobs like doctors and lawyers and architects and real estate agents. All these jobs, what they have in common is that they ultimately depend on the existing wealth in the community because they sell a service to the local resident of the community. And so the local service sector represents the vast majority of jobs in any city and in San Francisco, but the local service sector is never the driver of employment growth. It's always the effect of employment growth. It's because it reflects the existing wealth that exists in a community. And this is a key point. In San Francisco right now, that existing wealth is generated by and large by the innovation sector, which sells goods and services outside the city and brings in wealth. That wealth is then spent in supporting the jobs for the 2/3 of the workers who work in the local service sector. That's a key point because it means that the prosperity and the wages and the employment of 2/3 of the San Francisco labor force depend essentially on the dynamism of the high-tech and the innovation sector, the broader innovation sector. In other words, if Salesforce had one software engineer position in downtown San Francisco, you're going to see more jobs for the waiters, the taxi drivers, the doctors, the lawyers, the architects that provide service to that person. It doesn't work the other way around. If we had one more taxi driver, we're not going to see another job at Salesforce. I call this the multiplier effect. And my research, which is based on all U.S. metro areas, not just the San Francisco, it includes data for about 8 million workers over the past 30 years, suggests that this multiplier effect is particularly large for the innovation sector. I estimate that for each innovation jobs, 5 additional jobs in local services are ultimately created in the community. Of these, 2 are professional positions, the doctors, the lawyers, the real estate agents, and so on, the teachers. 3 are non-professional jobs, the retail clerks, the waiters, the carpenters, the dog walkers, the child care specialists, and so on. So in some sense, it's a rising tide that lifts all boats. And I think this is important when we think about the backlash that the growth of high tech has generated in the San Francisco community. Let me just give you an example of how large this multiplier effect is. Let's think about Twitter, for example. At my last count, Twitter had 900 employees in mid-market. Now, the indirect job creation that Twitter presence is responsible for accounts for 4,500 additional jobs. 1,800 of which are for professional workers, and 2,700 of which are for non-professional workers. So surprisingly and crucially, the most important impact that a company like Twitter has on the San Francisco labor market is not in high tech. It's actually outside high tech. Now, every sector of the economy has a multiplier. Manufacturing has a multiplier. Pretty much any other sector of the economy has a multiplier, but the innovation sector has the largest multiplier of all. By my estimate, high tech generates 3 times more service jobs per position than traditional manufacturing. Why is the multiplier effect so much larger for an high tech job than for a manufacturing job? Well, one is that high tech workers are better paid, and therefore they consume more local services in the local economy. They go more to the restaurant, they go more to the barber, they use more therapists, and so on. 2, high-tech companies themselves use a lot of local services. Anything from specialized IP lawyers to specialized technicians who clean their lab, and anything in between. And this also adds to the multiplier effect. And 3 is that there is a very strong clustering effect in high tech, whereby if a city attracts high tech, it will be able to attract even more high tech in the future. And this makes the multiplier effect even stronger. Okay? So I want to draw 5 conclusions from these facts that I think can help the policy debate in the city. The first conclusion is that even in a place like San Francisco, the high tech employs a minority of workers. And the real reason why, as a community, we are doing well is not that high tech will ever employ the majority of us, but is that high tech generates the wealth that then supports the jobs for the 2/3 of us who don't work in high tech, who work in local services. Okay, so that's one fundamental reason why the brain hubs are growing so fast. They have a very productive, very innovative traded sector that brings in the wealth that then is spent in the local economy to support the majority of the workers who work in the local service sector. Conclusion number 2, and this is probably surprising, is that today, one of the best ways to create jobs for the least educated of our residents is, ironically, to attract high-tech companies that hire highly educated workers. The jobs for the least educated of our residents are not going to come from manufacturing anymore. They're going to come from local service sectors, and the way to get local service sector jobs is to attract highly skill-intensive, high-tech companies. So recent initiatives that the mayor and the city are taking to try to retain and foster high-tech job creation in the city are actually, they make economic sense. It's not just about those high-tech jobs. Most importantly, it's about the jobs for the rest of the community. Conclusion number 3 is that policies that penalize high tech are ultimately counterproductive for the broader community. One good example was the payroll tax of San Francisco, probably one of the worst taxes you can think of, because you're taxing the very people that are creating jobs for the entire community. So Prop E, the success of Prop E was a very important good news. But it's just the first step. I think the next step is to rethink, and this is conclusion 4, to rethink about our land use regulations. Land use regulations that favor manufacturing, even light manufacturing, over high tech, I think they make little economic sense. People think about PDR, a certain part of the political class in Berkeley and San Francisco think about PDR, which is light manufacturing, as a way to preserve good blue-collar jobs for the least skilled of our citizens. But the reality is that if you really want to foster jobs for high school graduates or high school dropouts who live in Berkeley and San Francisco, what you should do is you should favor high-tech uses. So you should limit PDR and allow high-tech labs and high-tech office space in places that now are grossly underutilized because they're forced by land use regulation to be light manufacturing. Conclusion number 5 has to do with the dark side of job creation, which is the increasing cost of living, driven by a very fast increasing rents. Now, in my view, the best way to keep rents in check is to vastly expand the supply of market rate housing. And this is where our city has failed. San Francisco has chosen to be very, very constraining in how much market rate housing it permits. And when you compare cost of living in San Francisco with cost of living in other progressive cities like Seattle, which have been much more accommodating, you're going to see that for the same type of job creation, we have much higher increasing cost of living. It makes sense. Demand is increasing, and supply is not increasing as much. We really need to increase supply of housing if we want to keep rents in check. And I think the main beneficiary will be the most vulnerable of our residents, which are the renters. Okay, I'm done, and I'm happy to take any question.